Well, actually, I did have one question, but you kind of pretty much answered it. Was who, in your opinion, is probably the best conference out there, and who would probably be second? And you did mention SC, and then probably the Pac-12 right after that. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment right there. So.
Well, my thought when it comes to conferences, and I love the conference argument. I do a lot of analysis on conferences. I went through and built a whole metric on comparing the conferences last year because most of it's based on perception. And when you really grind down the numbers of what happened on the field last year, I still think that the SEC was slightly by a slim margin the best conference last year. But actually on the field results, if you grind them down against the other Power 5 conferences, the Pac-12 played better than everybody else. I seeded everyone. I lined up the scores and the results, and the Pac-12 went 13-6. And I actually weighted the games based on the seeding of the teams in each conference. And the Pac-12 played better than everybody else in the Power 5, top to bottom.
When you're talking about only last year, I will definitely agree with you there. I think year in, year out, though, SEC is the best now. Just to be fair about it, though, are they like the best and everybody else is 10th? No. There is definitely a small gap between the Pac-12 and then the SEC on a year in, year out basis, But based on your assessment that you said, and you're looking at only at last year, I could definitely see why you would come up with what you saw when you looked at the particular numbers. Because I could definitely make a case last year was a better year for the Pac-12 over the SEC. Now this year, though, I'm seeing up at the top there's a little bit more parity going on in the SEC, but the whole conference themselves probably have gone down just a tad, just because you had what went on in Florida or this past week. That's why I'm picking them to lose, because they're QB. I don't think Alabama is as good as they are, but I'm looking at all the teams across the landscape. I cannot pick out one good team because no team's perfect, but there's just so many flaws. It seems like with a lot of the top teams out there, it's very difficult to actually pinpoint a top team. And I just think Alabama is not as good. They're playing away at Texas A&M, where they have the rowdy crowd over there, and Texas A&M's a solid ball team this year as well too.
I think one of the reasons the SEC maintains its status is, first of all, it comes down to recruiting, and the SEC typically takes half of the top 300 recruits in the country,
which is very true.
Other conferences take the rest. The reason, though, that the SEC hasn't played as well last season, I think, is if you look at the quarterback class the year before, Johnny Manziel, A.J. McCarron, Zach Mettenberger, Aaron Murray at Georgia, James Franklin at Missouri, who won an Eastern Division championship, they all left.
Yeah.
And they weren't replaced with nearly as good a quarterbacks in the SEC, where that's where the Pac-12 excels, quarterback and wide receiver play.
Exactly. Very good point.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love the conference comparisons. And when the SEC was going through its 7 consecutive championships, I don't think there was any question that the SEC was the best conference. But I think there becomes this national narrative, and it's just groupthink that they just look at who won the final game, and then the argument stops.
See, that's where I would say that I would argue if we had had the playoffs at that point, it might not have been 7 straight. So that is an interesting. It's about time college football got a playoff, and then that change. I mean, there's a lot more parity, I think, than you were just saying. I mean, I think that parity's been for quite a while lately, where yes, the SEC is the better conference, but not by as much as they want to say they are.
And let's understand, in winning 7 consecutive championships, that the SEC was afforded the opportunity to play in all those games. No other conference could play in all those games. So it's not like the Big 12 showed up 7 consecutive years, or the Big 10 or any other conference had the opportunity to send a team 7 consecutive years. So the SEC did have that opportunity to send a team each and every year. Now, they won the game, but the other conferences didn't have an entry in all 7 years. They had to split the other 7 openings in the championship game between the other conferences, and actually got shut out in 2011 because it was Alabama versus LSU.
I do enjoy the all the conference talk about which conference is better and where they all rank and so forth. But one thing I noticed, at least now, I'm only isolating this thing on Twitter because I do like to look at Twitter while I'm watching some of the games on TV, is that people are like, no, this team's going to lose because they're in this conference. I'm like, why are you basing it just on that? Well, this team has this, that, and the other thing going from but they're in this. But they're just one conference. They're weak, and I'm just like, I think sometimes though that we need to kind of step away from looking at the conference aspect of things and look at the team aspect of things, because you have to keep in mind the Big Ten got hammered last year. As far as where did the champion come from? And I will agree, Big Ten was a sucky conference last year, but guess what? They had the best team in the country.
Yeah, and the same thing happened the year before. You could make the argument the ACC was the worst conference, but Florida State was the best team and won the national championship.
Exactly.
It's funny how the national perception, it can never be balanced or objective. It just swings. So when the Big Ten lost all those games that particular week 2 last year, Ohio State loses to Virginia Tech, Michigan gets blasted by Notre Dame, Oregon beats Michigan State. Oh, the Big Ten's the worst. And rightfully so to a certain extent based on that little small sample size.
Yep.
But then here we are 12, 13 weeks later, suddenly the Big Ten's great because Ohio State finishes things off and Michigan State wins the Cotton Bowl and Wisconsin beats Auburn in a bowl game. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a little redemption for the Big Ten. They did win the big prize, but let's balance these two scenarios out. We're talking about like basing an entire conference perception on 3 games in 1 week. So they're the worst. And then suddenly 12 weeks later, wow, the Big Ten's back. The Big Ten's great.
Yeah. No. Well, I personally don't really quite buy the thought like, hey, this conference is great just because, okay, they won a bunch of bowl games. I'm like, so what? What'd you get at the end of the day? Yeah, you persuaded a couple of other recruits, which is very important, mind you, but I'm saying here that 99% of these bowl games here, once when the bowl game is done, you get one team gets a trophy at the end, the other one gets some parting gifts, kind of thing. This isn't that's why I'm glad to see the playoff. We have 3 games in there that actually matter in some type of aspect.
Yeah, I'm not real happy with the playoff in that we've got 5 conferences and we've got 4 teams, and then if Notre Dame is able to put themselves in position, we're going to shut out another conference. But what it does, and James kind of alluded to this, at least it affords 2 other teams that have earned the right and have the resume the opportunity to play. So at least it affords 4 teams instead of just 2 the opportunity to show that they might be the best.
The part in the playoff that first off here, I do think that they are going to expand, and I think it'll be great when they do the expansion to 8 teams. But with that said, though, I do find it very interesting, though it makes college football, especially in the second half of the season, a little bit more appealing because we have these 4 teams here. Somebody's going to get shut. Some conference is going to get completely shut out. You're going to have 3 or 4, maybe 5 teams that deserve a spot. They're not going to get it because these other 4 got it. And I just think it just puts a little bit more intrigue in a lot of that.
So, Claire, if we go to 8 teams, the reason I would like to then go to a formula schedule is, okay, you got 5 power conferences. Obviously, those champions get automatic entry, and then you've got 3 other spots. Well, you got to try to distinguish these other teams. It's almost like trying to distinguish last year, TCU and Baylor versus Ohio State. How do you do that? They don't play anyone similar. They played like this game against Minnesota proved to be like this big deal because TCU played Minnesota and Ohio State played Minnesota, and that's the only way we can in any way compare these 2 teams. Yeah. So I would love to go to a formula schedule that would basically take the scheduling out of the hands of the schools that have their own self-interest in mind and an agenda, and build a formula schedule, and therefore you build equality in the non-conference scheduling, and then you can start to compare second-place teams, and you can build a formula that slots the 3 best wildcard teams to fill out the 8-team format.
That's something there I could definitely go with. With that said, though, I do enjoy the respect of debate, and you have to keep in mind too, there are a little more than 100 college football teams in Division I out there. And how many weeks are you really playing? When you get right down to it, it's a very small percentage. And I'm not looking at the fact like, okay, you have your SEC, all the you have to play some in your conference and so forth in there, but it's a very small percentage, and that's like, I think that's one thing that makes college football great, is just because it's just that whole debate in there. It's not like some of these other ones out there, some of these pro teams where things are a little bit more formulated and orderly, and then you have to play 7 games to figure out who's good. Hey, show up. If you don't show up, you're going home.
And what bothers me about the scheduling, and the reason I bring up the formula schedule, is let's take the Big 12. At the beginning of the season, most people thought the Big 12 was the worst of the Power 5 conferences, and I would have argued that most likely it was. I know that it's a battle between the ACC and the Big 12. Mm-hmm. Now, suddenly, for some reason, I'm hearing on the national level that the Big 12 is back, that the Big 12 is a great conference, and basically, we're basing this on 2 games. Oklahoma went to Tennessee and beat a team that's now lost 3 games. 3, maybe 4? 3 games. And TCU went to Minnesota and beat a marginal Minnesota team. Otherwise, that entire conference plays in a silo. The conferences, once they start playing conference games, they're playing in silos. And it's just an eye test after that. There's no objective results after that. And it's just simply, how exciting do we think the games are? And because there are these exciting games in the Big 12 with TCU putting up 50-some points, that people are saying the Big 12 is really good. But it's based on no objective results because they're playing each other.
Exactly.
How likely, is there any talk of that? Seems like we're a long ways away from that happening.
What, expanding the playoff?
Well, no, I can see that before, but the scheduling the way you were speaking.
Oh, man, would I love to build a formula schedule. And I wouldn't do it quite like the NFL, because the NFL is trying to create parity, so they make it more difficult on the good teams and easier on the bad teams. But I would want to build an equal non-conference schedule. So the 4 games based on last year's standings. So whether you're Alabama or Kansas, or regardless of where you finished the year before, your 4 non-conference games would be as equal as they can be. You can't predict how good teams are going to be the next year, but based on last year's results, would be equal. No, I think that I've not heard anybody talk about that. I just came up with that. So,
and I just knowing how the schools right now, want to play certain ones, and there's the money involved, and there's so many factors that it just seems like the playoffs was hard enough to get. That seems even more unlikely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No. This is also a little. Overall, I do. When you explained it a little bit better there, I do like it. I do like it a little bit better. But you also have to think about, this is just the reality of it, though. You do have the money aspect of things, and you do also have some of the politics as well. So let me give you one quick example for the politics, and we could go and proceed. You have 3 state schools in the state of Arizona. You have the U of A, ASU, and the other one's NAU. NAU is a 1AA school. They're actually a really good 1AA school. They've been in the playoffs for the past couple of years. I think they won the title one or 2 years ago as well in that playoff.
You're talking about an FCS team, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Arizona State Board of Regents, they require NAU to play either U of A or ASU once a year. So when you talk about your scheduling, you're not talking about some of the politics that could come into play with something like that there. Something like that there is not really going to quite work out per se.
Well, you could make that part of the formula. Therefore, they would need to balance that out by playing a little bit tougher of a schedule.
Okay.
In the other 3 non-conference games. And then the other problem we have in all this is that every conference is different. You have 3 14-team conferences, you get a 12, and you've got a 10. So while the Big 12 takes a hit at the end of the season and not playing a championship game, and that looks bad and probably hurt them last year in getting into the college football playoff, in a sense, it's the truest championship because everybody's playing everyone.
Very, very good point.
While what bothers me in the Big Ten, the ACC, and the SEC is that you've got 14 teams playing 8-game schedules. So they're missing 5 conference opponents. So the variance in scheduling difficulty is huge. So, for example, man, I went through all the schedules and I rated I rated the schedules 1 through whatever, 68 or 69, whatever it is. Take Miami and Georgia Tech in the ACC Coastal Division. So you play everybody in your division, which is fine, which is great. So 6 of your 8 games are exactly the same, but the other 2, Miami and Georgia Tech, have to play Clemson and Florida State, the 2 best teams by far in that conference. And there are other teams like Virginia Tech who are playing Wake and Syracuse. You talk about that's a 2-game swing. That's not even close. That's how there was one year when Alabama and LSU were by far the 2 best teams in the SEC. This was about 5 years ago. There was one year where LSU's crossover games in the other division were Florida and Georgia, and they both went 7-1. They played 2 teams that finished 14-2 in the SEC. Alabama's 2 were Kentucky and Vandy, and they went 2-14. So you talk about an advantage of scheduling when you're playing 6 exact games, and then the other 2 are 14-2. Oh, I played 2 teams. They went 2-14 last year. That's crazy.
That is.
The Pac-12 almost has it right. They do it about as well as anyone that's not able to play everyone, because they've got 9 games and only 12 teams. So you're hitting 9 of the 11 other teams. So the schedules are pretty comparable in the Pac-12.
Yeah, and whoever doesn't have to face Oregon usually gets a break that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, when we had the original Pac-10, they what they did was, you played every team once, except there's one team you did not play for 2 years straight.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for example, Ole Miss, and you guys probably are familiar with this. This is the same in the ACC, the SEC, and the Big Ten, where one of your 2 non-division games has been designated as your rival in that other division, so you play them every year. Well, actually, that's the way it is in the SEC and the ACC. Well, Ole Miss's non-division rival is Vanderbilt, so they always get to play Vanderbilt, and Mississippi State's is always Kentucky. Well, that helps out when Auburn always has to play Georgia. That's their game, and Florida always has to play LSU. Those are automatic tough games versus we always get to play Vandy. Mm-hmm. If we're Ole Miss, that's been our because there's really no real non-division rival, so they just had to match them up. They just wanted to keep the Alabama-Tennessee game going and the Auburn-Georgia game. They basically came up with that format just to preserve 2 games, is the reason that was set up like that. Miami's always got to play Florida State, who's almost always going to be the best team in the league.
Oh, so you're in the area where Ole Miss is, right?
I actually used to live down there. I covered the SEC for 6 years. I lived in Mississippi, but I'm in Connecticut now.
Okay.
I work at ESPN.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I didn't know. So you're still at ESPN then?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
I was just curious because the athletic director over at the U of A, Greg Byrne, he used to be athletic director at Ole Miss.
Oh, okay. What's his name?
Greg Byrne.
Do you know when he was at Ole Miss?
I could try to look it up, but he's been at the U of A now for maybe like 4 or 5 years or something like that.
Okay. I was in Mississippi from 94 to 2000. So Pete Boone was the Ole Miss athletic director then.
Okay, so that's probably he probably went. That was probably after then.
Yeah, but yeah, the playoff is better than the BCS. I used to have like a second job harping about the BCS every day.
It just never made sense how they kept arguing. I mean, I never really could follow the logic of ever not having a playoff be an advantageous thing, and you could make it all work.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't know how many people I've argued with that would make comments like, well, it always kind of worked itself out. No, it didn't work itself out.
Almost ever.
Exactly. The very first year, this is the classic example, and I could almost go through every year, and it rarely worked, was in 1998, the first year of the BCS. So you tell me who should play in the national championship game. Tennessee went undefeated. Fine. Other than that, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Florida State, UCLA, and Arizona all went 10-1. Who should play Tennessee in the national championship game? Florida State played them. Why? I don't know. Florida State lost to a 6-5 North Carolina State team. I don't know why they went to the national championship game instead of 5 other one-loss teams. Made no sense. Somebody had to play, but the same thing in 2007. There was just like a line of one-loss teams, and Ohio State got to go. Why? I don't know.
They're we grow State, up with all sports. You play a playoff. Everything has a playoff, but the one sport, for whatever reason, doesn't have a playoff. So finally, in 2014, we get a playoff.
We finally get around to it. I used to argue with people, and they thought I was crazy, but I was trying to make a point. I'd say, we might as well go back to the days of the polls. Let's just vote at the end of the season. At least we weren't making a farce out of it and trying to pretend that there was actually a legitimate championship game. At least we knew, okay, this doesn't make sense, but this is the way it is.
When you're dealing with some of the polls, what do you think about the idea of doing away with the preseason polling, not doing any polling until maybe like 1/3 or halfway through?
You guys are making too much sense. What? So I had the top 25 poll that I created based on just, and I'm not trying to say that this is perfect in any way, but I was at least trying to look at the schedule results.
Yeah.
I had Ohio State ranked 11th in the country. I think they have the 11th best resume right now based on results. Now, the opportunity is right in front of them with Michigan State and Michigan to correct that, and they'll have their opportunity. But based on beating who, are they number 1 in the country right now? The 2 best teams they've beaten are in, and they're not very good.
No. I don't know. I just I do look at the preseason polls like anybody else does, but I don't put any sort of weight at all in them. And meanwhile, people are like, fun. Oh my God, I can't believe this team is ranked like this. I'm like,
and it doesn't matter. That's the thing. As long as you win, you'll make your way up into the top 25 and where you need to be. That's why I don't understand why there's so much pressure or so much whatever
focus on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, fortunately, that's another good point to the college football playoff is there's a committee that supposedly doesn't even look at the poll. They just look at the resumes of the teams and how they played. So this poll's not going to matter. It doesn't even matter now, really, but it's really not going to matter in a few weeks. Whereas if this was 2 years ago, this poll means everything. And what's funny about the defenders of the BCS is they would say this is an objective system because it's computer. Well, only 1/3 of it was computer. The 2/3 was a human vote, so which completely manipulated the end result.
It did. That's one. I was not a fan of the BCS like a lot of other people were, but we still watched most of the games. But they the one thing that they did do right was they did not release the polls until what 2/3 through the season. And the selection, this playoff committee, they're doing very similar type of thing. They're going to let a bunch of the games go by so that way they can do an assessment and then release what they're thinking.
Again, I used to make a point when we would argue about the BCS that I didn't believe in, but just to make a point, I would say, what is the best sport to apply the BCS to is Major League Baseball. They've got the largest sample of games. You can actually take when these teams play each other 19 times and they're playing 162 games against each other, that's the best sport to apply the BCS to, a computer system to determine who the best teams are. They've played the largest sample of games. Apply the BCS to that, not to a bunch of teams that haven't even played a team that played the other team. You can't even connect the dots with these teams around college football.
That's a good point.
You know, the Pac-12 and the SEC didn't even play a game against each other last year in the regular season or the postseason, and we're comparing teams between the Pac-12 and the SEC. But we've got a computer that's going to do it.